The blizzard of 1887 was unlike anything the people of Cedar Falls, Wyoming, had ever witnessed. Snow fell in sheets so thick that the town's main street disappeared beneath a blanket of white that reached the second-story windows. The wind howled with such ferocity that it stripped paint from buildings and sent livestock seeking shelter in whatever refuge they could find. It was on this brutal December night that fate would bring together two souls whose love story would reshape the American West forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At precisely 11:47 p.m., the Union Pacific locomotive, number 429, came to a grinding halt at Cedar Falls Station, its massive iron wheels locked in place by ice that had formed faster than the crew could clear it. The train had been fighting the storm for 16 hours, crawling through mountain passes at a speed barely faster than a walking pace, its headlight cutting through the darkness like a desperate beacon searching for salvation. Among the passengers, trapped aboard, was Clara May Whitfield, a 24-year-old nurse from Boston who had been traveling west to accept a position at the Territorial Hospital in Sacramento. She pressed her face against the frost-covered window of the passenger car, watching the station platform emerge from the swirling snow like a ghost from another world. The small wooden building looked abandoned, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Against the storm's fury, Clara had been traveling for 6 days, her savings nearly depleted by the unexpected delays and additional expenses that had mounted. With each hour, the train fell further behind schedule. She wore her finest dress, a deep blue wool garment that had seemed appropriate for travel when she left Boston, but now felt woefully inadequate against the brutal cold that seemed to seep through the train car's walls. Her thin leather gloves, fashionable in the city, provided no protection against the numbing cold that had settled into her bones. The conductor, a grizzled man named Pete Morrison, who had been working the rails for 30 years, made his way through the passenger car. With news that would change everything, his weathered face bore the grim expression of someone delivering inevitable but unwelcome tidings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced, his voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the car's windows, "I'm afraid we're going to be stuck here until this storm passes. Could be hours, could be days. The tracks ahead are completely blocked, and we can't get word through to the next station." Clara felt her heart sink as she calculated the implications. Her carefully planned journey had already consumed most of her traveling funds, and she had been counting on reaching Sacramento within the week to begin earning the salary that would sustain her. More immediately pressing was the fact that the train's heating system had been struggling against the cold, and the passenger car was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the temperature outside continued to plummet. As the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of abating, Clara found herself in an increasingly desperate situation. The other passengers, mostly men traveling on business or family members with resources to weather the delay, had made arrangements with local residents or secured rooms at the town's small hotel. But Clara, traveling alone with limited funds and no connections in this remote Wyoming town, faced the terrifying prospect of spending the night in the unheated train car. By 2 a.m., the situation had become critical. The train's heating system had finally succumbed to the extreme cold, and frost was beginning to form on the interior walls of the passenger car. Clara wrapped herself in her traveling cloak and the thin blanket provided by the railroad, but the cold was relentless, seeping through every layer of clothing and threatening to overwhelm her body's ability to maintain warmth. It was then that she made the decision that would alter the course of her life forever. Rather than remain in the train car and risk freezing to death, Clara gathered her few belongings and stepped out onto the station platform, hoping to find some form of shelter or assistance in the small frontier town. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and immediately numbing her exposed skin. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face and threatened to knock her from her feet as she struggled toward the station building. Snow clung to her eyelashes and filled her mouth as she gasped for air in the thin mountain atmosphere. The station building, when she finally reached it, proved to be locked and apparently abandoned for the night. Clara pounded on the door with fists that had already lost feeling, calling out for help that she knew was unlikely to come. The town beyond the station appeared completely shut down, its buildings dark and silent against the storm. Desperation drove her to seek shelter beneath the station's covered platform, where she huddled against the building's wall in a futile attempt to escape the wind. Her traveling dress, soaked through with snow, clung to her body like ice, and she could feel her strength beginning to ebb as hypothermia set in. Her hands and feet had long since lost all sensation, and a dangerous drowsiness was beginning to cloud her thoughts. It was in this moment of complete vulnerability that Clara began to accept the possibility that she might not survive the night. She thought of her family back in Boston, of the letter she had written to her parents, describing her excitement about the new position in California, and of all the patients she would never have the chance to help. The irony was not lost on her that she, a trained nurse who had devoted her life to healing others, might die alone and helpless on a train platform in the middle of nowhere. Meanwhile, 3 miles outside of town at the sprawling Double Diamond Ranch, Millionaire cattle, Baron Jackson Cole Hartwell was conducting his own battle against the storm. At 31, Jackson had built one of the largest cattle operations in the Wyoming Territory through a combination of shrewd business sense, relentless hard work, and an uncanny ability to anticipate market trends that had made him one of the wealthiest men west of the Mississippi. The Double Diamond Ranch encompassed over 50,000 acres of prime grazing land, supporting herds that numbered in the thousands. Jackson's success had come not through inheritance or luck, but through years of calculated risks and personal sacrifice that had transformed him from a penniless orphan into one of the territory's most influential citizens. But on this particular night, Jackson's wealth and influence were powerless against the fury of nature. He had spent the evening in his ranch house office, poring over financial records and correspondence by lamplight, when the storm reached its peak intensity. The wind had become so violent that it threatened the structural integrity of even his well-built home, and Jackson knew that his livestock would be suffering terribly in the exposed pastures. Despite the obvious danger, Jackson made the decision to venture out into the storm to check on his cattle and ensure that his ranch hands had managed to secure the animals in whatever shelter was available. He was a man who had never asked his employees to face dangers he wouldn't face himself, and the thought of his animals suffering while he remained safe indoors was intolerable to him. Jackson bundled himself in heavy winter clothing, including a thick buffalo coat that had served him well through many Wyoming winters, and made his way to the barn where he saddled Thunder, a massive black stallion that had been his companion through countless adventures across the territory. The horse was nervous and reluctant to leave the warmth of the stable, but Jackson's gentle but firm guidance convinced the animal to venture out into the night. The ride toward the winter pastures was treacherous, with snowdrifts that reached Thunder's chest and wind that threatened to unseat Jackson from his saddle. Visibility was virtually non-existent, and Jackson had to rely on his intimate knowledge of his own land and Thunder's sure-footed navigation to avoid the ravines and obstacles that could prove fatal in such conditions. After hours of searching through the storm, Jackson was relieved to discover that his ranch hands had successfully moved most of the cattle to sheltered areas near the ranch buildings. The animals were cold and miserable, but they would survive the night. It was while returning to the ranch house that Jackson made a decision that seemed insignificant at the time, but would prove to be the most important choice of his life. Rather than taking the direct route home, Jackson decided to check on the town of Cedar Falls, knowing that the storm might have caused problems for the residents and that his assistance might be needed. As one of the area's most prominent citizens, Jackson felt a responsibility to help his neighbors during times of crisis, and the severity of this particular storm suggested that people might be in genuine need of aid. The ride to town was even more challenging than his journey to check on the cattle, but thunder proved equal to the task, carrying Jackson through snowdrifts and across windswept terrain with the steadiness that had made the horse invaluable to the rancher's operations. As they approached Cedar Falls, Jackson could see the dim outline of the stranded train at the station, its cars looking like dark shadows against the white landscape. It was then that Jackson spotted something that made him urge thunder forward with sudden urgency. There, huddled against the station building like a bundle of discarded clothing, was a human figure barely visible in the swirling snow. Jackson's heart raced as he realized that someone was trapped outside in conditions that would surely prove fatal within hours. Dismounting quickly, Jackson rushed toward the figure, his boots crunching through snow that reached his knees. As he drew closer, he could see that it was a young woman, her dark hair matted with ice and her clothing soaked through with melted snow. She was barely conscious, her lips blue with cold and her breathing shallow and irregular. "Miss, can you hear me?" Jackson called out, dropping to his knees beside Clara and immediately beginning to assess her condition. His years of ranch life had taught him to recognize the signs of severe hypothermia, and he knew that quick action was essential to save her life. Clara's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, and she found herself looking into the concerned face of a stranger whose presence seemed too good to be true. Through the haze of cold and exhaustion, she could see that he was a large man with kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors. His voice was deep and reassuring, cutting through the wind and the confusion that clouded her thoughts. "I'm going to get you out of here," Jackson said firmly, already removing his heavy buffalo coat and wrapping it around Clara's trembling form. The coat was enormous on her small frame, but its warmth was immediate and life-saving, providing the first relief from the cold that she had felt in hours. Without hesitation, Jackson lifted Clara into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, and alarmed by the way her body shook uncontrollably with cold. He carried her quickly to where Thunder waited, the horse standing patiently despite the storm's fury, and carefully mounted while keeping Clara secure in his arms. The ride back to the Double Diamond Ranch was a race against time, with Jackson urging Thunder forward while trying to protect Clara from the wind and snow that continued to assault them. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, but she was vaguely aware of the strength of the arms that held her and the steady rhythm of the horse's movement beneath them. Jackson's ranch house emerged from the storm like a beacon of hope, its windows glowing with warm lamplight that promised safety and comfort. Jackson carried Clara directly inside, calling out for his housekeeper, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, a capable woman who had managed his household for the past 5 years and whose practical skills extended far beyond domestic duties. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jackson shouted as he carried Clara into the main parlor, where a fire blazed in the massive stone fireplace. "I need hot water, blankets, and anything you can find for warming someone who's nearly frozen to death." Eleanor appeared immediately, her experienced eyes taking in the situation at a glance. She was a woman in her 50s, who had raised 6 children of her own and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies on the frontier. Without asking questions, she began preparing what would be needed to treat severe hypothermia. Jackson laid Clara gently on the sofa near the fireplace, carefully removing the wet clothing that threatened to continue cooling her body. Elena took charge of the situation with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with similar emergencies before, wrapping Clara in warm, dry blankets and beginning the careful process of gradually raising her body temperature. "She's in bad shape," Elena observed quietly as she worked. "Another hour out there and we would have lost her. What's her name? Where did you find her?" Jackson realized that in his urgency to save the woman's life, he had never learned her identity. "I found her at the train station, nearly frozen to death. The train must be stranded by the storm." He watched anxiously as Elena continued her ministrations, noting the way Clara's breathing was beginning to stabilize and how some color was returning to her pale cheeks. It was then that Clara's eyes opened fully for the first time since Jackson had found her. She looked around the unfamiliar room with confusion, taking in the luxurious furnishings, the warmth of the fire, and the faces of the two strangers who had apparently saved her life. "Where am I?" she asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson moved closer to the sofa, his expression gentle and reassuring. "You're safe now. I'm Jackson Hartwell, and this is Mrs. Rodriguez. I found you at the train station during the storm. You nearly froze to death out there." Clara tried to sit up, but Elena gently pressed her back down onto the cushions. "You need to rest and get warm," the housekeeper said firmly. "You're not going anywhere until this storm passes, and you've recovered your strength." As Clara lay there, gradually warming and beginning to comprehend what had happened to her, she studied the face of the man who had saved her life. Jackson Hartwell was unlike any man she had ever encountered. His features were rugged and weathered by years of outdoor work, but his eyes held a kindness and intelligence that spoke of depth beneath the rough exterior. He was clearly a man of means, judging by the quality of his home and the deference shown to him by his housekeeper, but there was nothing pretentious or condescending in his manner. "I'm Clara Whitfield," she managed to say, her voice growing stronger as warmth returned to her body. "I was traveling to California to take a position as a nurse at a hospital in Sacramento. The train was stranded by the storm, and I didn't have anywhere to go." Jackson nodded, understanding immediately the desperate circumstances that had led to her nearly fatal exposure to the elements. "Well, Miss Whitfield, you're welcome to stay here until the storm passes and the trains are running again. It's the least I can do." What neither Jackson nor Clara could have anticipated in that moment was that the storm would continue for 6 more days, trapping them together in the ranch house and setting in motion a series of events that would transform both of their lives forever. The blizzard that had nearly claimed Clara's life would prove to be the beginning of a love story that would indeed make history, challenging social conventions and ultimately changing the very fabric of life in the American West. As Clara settled into the warmth and safety of Jackson's home, she had no way of knowing that she would never reach Sacramento, never take the nursing position she had traveled so far to accept, and never return to the life she had planned for herself in California. Instead, she was about to embark on an adventure that would test everything she believed about love, social class, and the possibilities that existed for a determined woman in the frontier territories of America. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first rays of dawn struggled through the frost-covered windows of the Double Diamond Ranch, casting pale shadows across the parlor where Clara had spent the night recovering from her brush with death. The blizzard continued its relentless assault on the Wyoming landscape, but inside Jackson's home, a different kind of storm was brewing as two worlds collided in ways neither had anticipated. Clara awakened to the unfamiliar luxury of Egyptian cotton sheets and down pillows, a stark contrast to the boarding house accommodations she had grown accustomed to during her nursing training in Boston. Mrs. Rodriguez had moved her to one of the guest bedrooms during the night, and Clara found herself surrounded by furnishings that spoke of wealth beyond anything she had ever experienced. Hand-carved mahogany furniture, Persian rugs, and oil paintings depicting Western landscapes adorned the room, each piece clearly chosen by someone with both means and refined taste. As consciousness fully returned, Clara began to process the magnitude of her situation. She was stranded in a stranger's home, completely dependent on his hospitality, with no means of continuing her journey to California and no way to communicate with the outside world. The independence she had fought so hard to achieve seemed to have vanished in a single night, replaced by a vulnerability that challenged everything she believed about her own capabilities. Clara had not arrived at this crossroads by accident. Born into a middle-class Boston family, she was the daughter of Thomas Whitfield, a respected but poorly paid minister who had devoted his life to serving the city's immigrant communities, and Margaret Whitfield, a former teacher who had sacrificed her own career to support her husband's calling. The Whitfield household had been one of intellectual stimulation but financial constraint, where books were plentiful but luxuries were rare. From an early age, Clara had demonstrated an unusual combination of academic brilliance and practical compassion that set her apart from her peers. While other girls her age were learning embroidery and piano, Clara was reading medical texts borrowed from the local doctor and tending to injured animals she found in the neighborhood. Her parents, progressive thinkers who believed in education for women, had encouraged her interests despite the social pressure to direct their daughter toward more conventional feminine pursuits. The decision to become a nurse had not been made lightly. In 1880s, Boston nursing was still a relatively new profession for women, one that required not only intelligence and skill, but also the courage to challenge social expectations about proper feminine behavior. Clara had enrolled in the nursing program at Massachusetts General Hospital against the wishes of several family members who believed that caring for strangers was beneath the dignity of a minister's daughter. Her 3 years of training had been the most challenging and rewarding of her life. She had learned to treat everything from childhood diseases to industrial accidents, working alongside doctors who initially resented her presence but gradually came to respect her competence and dedication. More importantly, she had discovered a sense of purpose that went beyond personal fulfillment, a calling to use her skills to heal suffering wherever she found it. The opportunity in Sacramento had represented more than just employment. It was Clara's chance to prove that a woman could build an independent life on the frontier, contributing to the development of new communities while maintaining her professional identity. The salary offered by the territorial hospital was modest, but sufficient to support herself comfortably, and the work would have allowed her to help establish medical care in a region desperately in need of qualified practitioners. Now, as Clara sat in Jackson's guest bedroom, wearing borrowed clothing and completely dependent on his charity, all of those carefully laid plans seemed as distant as the California sunshine she would never see. The irony was bitter. In trying to claim her independence, she had ended up more dependent on a man's goodwill than she had ever been in her life. Meanwhile, Jackson stood in his study, staring out at the continuing blizzard while wrestling with emotions he had never expected to experience. The presence of Clara Whitfield in his home had awakened feelings he had deliberately suppressed for years, forcing him to confront the carefully constructed isolation that had defined his adult life. Jackson's path to wealth and prominence had been forged through personal tragedy and relentless determination. Born to homesteaders who had arrived in Wyoming territory with nothing but dreams and determination, He had learned early that survival on the frontier required both physical toughness and mental resilience. His parents, David and Sarah Hartwell, had claimed their land under the Homestead Act, building a modest farm on what would later become part of the Double Diamond Ranch. The harsh realities of frontier life had shaped Jackson's character from childhood. Wyoming winters that killed livestock and destroyed crops, summer droughts that withered hopes along with harvests, and the constant threat of conflicts with displaced Native American tribes had taught him that security came only through strength and self-reliance. His parents had died when he was 17, victims of a typhoid epidemic that swept through the territory, leaving Jackson alone on the homestead with nothing but debt and determination. Rather than abandoning the land that had claimed his parents' lives, Jackson had made a decision that would define the rest of his existence. He mortgaged the homestead to buy cattle, borrowed against future harvests to purchase additional grazing rights, and worked 18-hour days to build what would eventually become one of the largest ranching operations in the territory. Every risk had been calculated, every decision made with the cold logic of survival rather than emotion. The success that followed had been spectacular but costly. By the age of 30, Jackson owned more land than some eastern states, employed dozens of ranch hands, and maintained business relationships with cattle buyers from Chicago to San Francisco. His financial acumen had extended beyond ranching, into banking, mining, and railroad investments that had multiplied his wealth exponentially. Politicians sought his endorsement, businessmen courted his partnership, and society matrons in Denver and Cheyenne competed to host him at their social gatherings. But wealth and success had come at the price of personal isolation. Jackson had deliberately avoided romantic entanglements, believing that emotional attachments would compromise the focus and determination that had driven his achievements. He had witnessed too many men lose their fortunes through poor decisions influenced by romantic relationships, and he had vowed never to allow such weakness to threaten his security. The few women who had moved in his social circles were primarily the wives and daughters of other wealthy ranchers and businessmen, women whose interest in him was transparently motivated by his financial status rather than genuine affection. Jackson had grown cynical about the possibility of finding a woman who could love him for himself rather than for what he could provide, and he had gradually resigned himself to a life of professional achievement without personal fulfillment. Clara's unexpected presence in his home had shattered that carefully maintained emotional distance. There was something about her courage in the face of desperate circumstances, her obvious intelligence and determination, and her complete lack of knowledge about his wealth that intrigued him in ways he had never experienced. For the first time in years, Jackson found himself genuinely curious about another person's thoughts and feelings, wanting to know more about the woman who had nearly died rather than compromise her principles by accepting charity she couldn't repay. As the morning progressed, Clara made her way downstairs to find Jackson in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the competence of a man accustomed to taking care of himself. This domestic scene surprised her. In Boston, wealthy men were waited upon by servants and would never be found performing such mundane tasks. Jackson's willingness to cook his own meals spoke of a different kind of character, one shaped by necessity rather than entitlement. "Good morning, Miss Whitfield," Jackson said, looking up from the cast-iron skillet where bacon sizzled over the wood-burning stove. "I hope you slept well?" "Mrs. Rodriguez had to return to her own family to check on them during the storm. So I'm afraid you're stuck with my cooking until she returns." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed by her continued dependence on his hospitality. "Mr. Hartwell, I can't continue to impose on your kindness. Surely there must be some way for me to contribute to my keep while I'm stranded here." "Jackson, turned to study her face, noting the determined set of her jaw and the proud tilt of her chin. He recognized the struggle between gratitude and independence that was clearly tormenting her, having experienced similar conflicts during his own rise from poverty to prosperity. "Miss Whitfield," he said carefully, "you're recovering from a serious case of hypothermia. The last thing you need to worry about is earning your keep. Besides, this storm shows no signs of letting up, and even when it does, it will be days before the railroad can clear the tracks. You're going to be here for a while, whether we like it or not." The practical reality of her situation settled over Clara like a weight. Her carefully planned journey to independence had been derailed by circumstances beyond her control, leaving her trapped in a situation that challenged everything she believed about proper behavior between unmarried men and women. In Boston society, a single woman staying unchaperoned in a bachelor's home would be grounds for social ostracism, regardless of the circumstances that had led to such impropriety. "Mr. Hartwell," Clara said, choosing her words carefully, "I appreciate your rescue and your hospitality more than I can express. But surely you understand that my continued presence here without proper chaperonage could damage both our reputations. People will talk, and in a small community like Cedar Falls, such talk can be devastating." Jackson poured coffee into 2 cups, considering her concerns. The truth was that he had already thought about the social implications of Clara's presence in his home, but he had dismissed them as less important than her safety and well-being. His wealth and position in the community provided him with a certain immunity from gossip, but Clara had no such protection. "Miss Whitfield," Jackson replied, "I've learned that people will talk regardless of what we do or don't do. The only thing that matters is what we know to be true about ourselves and our actions. You're here because I couldn't leave you to freeze to death, and you'll stay here as long as necessary because it's the right thing to do. Anyone who wants to make something improper out of that can answer to me." The quiet authority in Jackson's voice revealed something about his character that Clara had not previously recognized. This was a man accustomed to making decisions and standing by them, regardless of social pressure or conventional expectations. His willingness to defend her reputation at potential cost to his own spoke of an integrity that challenged her assumptions about wealthy men and their motivations. As they shared breakfast in the warm kitchen while the storm raged outside, Clara found herself studying Jackson with the same careful attention she had once devoted to her medical textbooks. Everything about him contradicted her expectations of how a millionaire should behave. He ate simple food with obvious enjoyment, spoke without pretension or artificial refinement, and treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with her social status or financial circumstances. "Tell me about your family," Jackson said as they finished eating. "They must be worried about your safety with this storm and the train delays." Clara's expression grew wistful as she thought of her parents back in Boston. "My father is a minister, and my mother was a teacher before she married. They supported my decision to become a nurse, even though some members of our congregation thought it was inappropriate for a minister's daughter to work in a hospital. They'll be worried when they don't receive my letter from Sacramento as planned." Jackson noted the past tense she used when describing her mother's career, recognizing the sacrifice that many women made when they married. "And they approved of your decision to travel to California alone?" "They understood that it was my best opportunity to use my training in a place where medical care is desperately needed," Clara replied. "Frontier communities need qualified nurses, and I wanted to be part of building something important rather than just maintaining what already existed." The passion in Clara's voice when she spoke about her work impressed Jackson. He had known many people who worked for money or social position, but few who were driven by a genuine desire to serve others. Her commitment to helping people, even at personal cost, reminded him of qualities he had once possessed but had gradually suppressed in his pursuit of financial success. "What made you choose nursing?" Jackson asked, genuinely curious about the experiences that had shaped her character. Clara was quiet for a moment, remembering the moment when her calling had first revealed itself. "When I was 12, there was a terrible fire in our neighborhood. A tenement building collapsed and many people were injured. I watched the doctors and nurses working to save lives, and I realized that there was no more important work in the world than healing suffering. I wanted to be part of that mission." The sincerity of her response moved Jackson in ways he hadn't expected. Clara's choice to dedicate her life to healing others stood in stark contrast to his own focus on accumulating wealth and power. For the first time in years, Jackson found himself questioning whether his achievements had any real meaning beyond his own security and comfort. As the day progressed, and the storm continued its assault on the Wyoming landscape, Clara and Jackson found themselves drawn into conversations that revealed the depths of their different worlds. Clara spoke of her work with immigrant families in Boston's poorest neighborhoods, of children saved from diseases that would have been fatal without proper medical care, and of the satisfaction that came from using her skills to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Jackson, in turn, shared stories of building his ranch from nothing, of the challenges of managing thousands of acres and hundreds of employees, and of the complex business decisions that had gradually expanded his influence throughout the territory. But as he spoke, he began to realize how isolated his success had made him, how few people he could call true friends rather than business associates or employees. The contrast between their values and priorities should have created an unbridgeable gulf between them, but instead it seemed to generate a mutual fascination that neither had anticipated. Clara found herself admiring Jackson's intelligence and determination, while Jackson was drawn to Clara's compassion and sense of purpose. Both recognized that they were encountering someone whose character challenged their assumptions about the world and their place in it. As evening fell and the storm showed no signs of abating, Clara and Jackson settled in the parlor before the fire, each lost in thoughts about the unexpected turn their lives had taken. Neither could have anticipated that their forced isolation would become the foundation for a relationship that would challenge social conventions and ultimately change the course of history in the American West. The blizzard that trapped them together was creating more than just physical proximity. It was forging an emotional connection that would prove stronger than the social barriers that separated their worlds. In the warm glow of the firelight, as snow continued to pile against the windows and wind howled across the prairie, Clara and Jackson were beginning to discover that love could indeed conquer the most formidable obstacles when it was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine understanding. On the third day of the blizzard, when the storm finally began to show signs of weakening, the outside world started to intrude upon the sanctuary that Jackson's ranch had become for Clara. The first harbinger of trouble arrived in the form of Reverend Josiah Cumberland, Cedar Falls's most prominent religious leader and self-appointed guardian of the town's moral standards. Reverend Cumberland was a tall, austere man in his 50s whose black clothing and severe demeanor had intimidated congregants for over 2 decades. He had built his reputation on fiery sermons about the dangers of moral corruption and the need for strict adherence to social propriety, particularly regarding relationships between unmarried men and women. His influence extended far beyond the pulpit. As president of the Cedar Falls Moral Reform Society, he had the power to ostracize anyone who violated his rigid standards of acceptable behavior. The Reverend arrived at the Double Diamond Ranch, accompanied by 3 prominent townspeople: Mayor Harold Fitzgerald, a portly politician whose primary concern was maintaining his position through careful alliance with the town's most influential citizens. Mrs. Prudence Blackwood, the banker's wife and undisputed leader of Cedar Falls Society, and Dr. Silas Thornton, the town's only physician and a man whose medical practice depended entirely on maintaining the good opinion of his wealthy patients. Jackson met them at the front door, his expression carefully neutral, despite the anger building in his chest. He had anticipated that Clara's presence in his home would eventually attract unwanted attention, but he had hoped to have more time before facing the inevitable confrontation with the town's moral authorities. "Reverend Cumberland," Jackson said, with cool politeness, "what brings you out in such weather?" The Reverend's piercing grey eyes surveyed Jackson with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Hartwell, I believe you know why we're here. Word has reached town about the situation involving yourself and a young woman of questionable reputation. As leaders of this community, we have a responsibility to address moral impropriety wherever we find it." Jackson felt his jaw tighten at the casual slander of Clara's character. "Reverend, if you're referring to Miss Whitfield, she's a qualified nurse who nearly froze to death at the train station. I provided shelter to someone in need of medical assistance. I fail to see how Christian charity has become a moral failing." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, her elaborate hat and expensive coat marking her as someone accustomed to social authority. "Mr. Hartwell, surely you understand that appearances matter in a civilized community. An unmarried woman residing unchaperoned in a bachelor's home creates scandal regardless of the circumstances that led to such an arrangement." Mayor Fitzgerald nodded vigorously, clearly eager to align himself with the town's moral arbiters. "The reputation of Cedar Falls is at stake here, Jackson. We can't have stories spreading about improper relationships between prominent citizens. It reflects poorly on all of us." Dr. Thornton, who had remained silent during the initial exchange, finally spoke up. "Mr. Hartwell, as a medical professional, I should examine Miss Whitfield to ensure she has recovered from her exposure. If she's well enough to travel, arrangements could be made for more appropriate accommodations in town." Jackson recognized the trap being laid for him. If he refused to allow Dr. Thornton to examine Clara, it would be interpreted as evidence of impropriety. If he agreed, Clara would be declared fit for travel and forced to leave the protection of his home, making her vulnerable to whatever punishment the town's moral guardians had in mind. "Miss Whitfield is welcome to stay here as long as necessary," Jackson replied firmly. "She's under no obligation to submit to examination or to justify her presence to anyone." From the top of the staircase, Clara had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. She understood immediately that her presence at the ranch had created exactly the kind of scandal she had feared, and that Jackson was now paying the price for his kindness. The knowledge that her reputation was being attacked was painful, but the realization that Jackson's standing in the community was being threatened because of her was unbearable. Clara descended the stairs with as much dignity as she could muster, wearing one of Mrs. Rodriguez's dresses that had been altered to fit her smaller frame. Her appearance in the doorway caused an immediate silence among the visitors, who studied her with barely concealed hostility. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Blackwood," Clara said with quiet authority, "I understand you have concerns about my presence here. Perhaps we could discuss this matter like civilized people rather than talking about me as if I weren't present." Reverend Cumberland's expression grew even more severe as he looked Clara up and down, clearly finding her wanting according to his moral standards. "Young lady, your behavior has created a scandal that threatens the moral fabric of our community. A decent woman would have found proper accommodations rather than compromising a respectable man's reputation." Clara felt anger flash through her at the casual cruelty of the accusation. Reverend Cumberland, a decent community would have ensured that a stranded traveller had access to proper shelter rather than leaving her to freeze to death on a train platform. Mr. Hartwell saved my life when no one else was willing to help. Mrs. Blackwood sniffed disdainfully. My dear girl, there are proper procedures for such situations. The Methodist ladies would have arranged appropriate lodging if you had simply made your circumstances known. The Methodist ladies were safely in their homes while I was dying of exposure, Clara replied sharply. Mr. Hartwell was the only person willing to venture out in a blizzard to help someone in need. Dr. Thornton attempted to assert his professional authority. Miss Whitfield, as the only qualified physician in Cedar Falls, I insist on examining you to determine your fitness for travel. If you've recovered sufficiently, continued residence here is both unnecessary and improper. Clara's nursing training had taught her to recognize medical incompetence, and she had observed enough during her brief time in town to question Dr. Thornton's qualifications. His breath smelled of alcohol even in the morning. His hands shook noticeably, and his general appearance suggested a man whose medical practice was more about social position than healing skills. Dr. Thornton, Clara said with professional coolness, I appreciate your concern, but as a trained nurse, I'm quite capable of assessing my own recovery. I will not be submitting to examination by someone whose medical credentials I have reason to question. The insult to Dr. Thornton's professional competence sent shockwaves through the group of visitors. In Cedar Falls, challenging the authority of established leaders was simply not done, particularly by someone as vulnerable as a stranded female traveler. Clara had just committed an act of defiance that would have far-reaching consequences. Mayor Fitzgerald cleared his throat nervously, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond his ability to manage diplomatically. Perhaps we should focus on finding a practical solution that satisfies everyone's concerns. Surely arrangements could be made for Miss Whitfield to stay with one of the respectable families in town until the railroad situation is resolved. Jackson stepped closer to Clara, a gesture of protection that was noted by everyone present. Miss Whitfield is welcome to remain here as long as she chooses. I won't see her turned out simply to satisfy gossip and social prejudice, Reverend. Cumberland's eyes narrowed as he observed the obvious bond between Jackson and Clara. His years of experience in moral crusades had taught him to recognize the signs of romantic attachment, and he could see that this situation represented something far more dangerous than simple impropriety. Mr. Hartwell, the Reverend said with ominous quiet, I think you fail to understand the seriousness of this situation. Your business interests in this community depend on maintaining the respect and confidence of your neighbors. Continued defiance of moral standards could have consequences that extend far beyond personal reputation. The threat was unmistakable, and Jackson felt a cold anger settle in his chest. His wealth and influence had always provided protection from such petty tyranny, but he was beginning to understand that even his resources had limits when confronted with organized social pressure. Mrs. Blackwood moved closer to the group, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. Jackson, you must understand that this isn't just about you and this person. The Women's Social Improvement League has significant influence over community standards. Our endorsement or disapproval can make or break social and business relationships throughout the territory. Clara felt the walls closing in around them as she realized the extent of the forces arrayed against their unconventional situation. These people wielded social power like a weapon, using moral righteousness as justification for controlling behavior that challenged their authority. She had encountered similar attitudes in Boston, but never in such concentrated and coordinated form. What exactly are you proposing? Jackson asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Dr. Thornton stepped forward, apparently emboldened by Jackson's question. Miss Whitfield should be examined by a qualified physician to determine her fitness for travel. If she's medically cleared, she should be relocated to appropriate accommodations under proper supervision until transportation can be arranged. Any attachment that may have developed should be severed immediately to prevent further scandal. The clinical coldness of the doctor's prescription for their lives infuriated Clara. These people were treating her, and Jackson liked specimens to be managed rather than human beings with the right to make their own choices about their lives and relationships. "And if we refuse?" Clara asked, looking directly at Reverend Cumberland. The Reverend's smile was thin and predatory. "Then you would face the consequences of defying community standards. Mr. Hartwell's business relationships would suffer as decent people distance themselves from scandal. His banking connections, cattle contracts, and political influence would all be subject to reconsideration. As for you, Miss Whitfield, your reputation would be destroyed throughout the territory. No respectable hospital or medical practice would employ a woman of questionable moral character." Jackson felt rage building inside him as he listened to the systematic threats being laid out against Clara's future. These people were using their social position to destroy anyone who refused to conform to their narrow vision of acceptable behavior, and they clearly had both the power and the willingness to carry out their threats. "Furthermore," Mrs. Blackwood added with obvious satisfaction, "the Women's Social Improvement League maintains correspondence with similar organizations throughout the West. Word of Miss Whitfield's situation would follow her wherever she attempted to practice nursing. Her career would be effectively ended." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of Mrs. Blackwood's threat sank in. These people had the power to destroy not just her immediate situation, but her entire professional future. Years of training and dedication could be wiped out by gossip and social pressure, leaving her with no means of supporting herself or contributing to the medical profession she loved. Mayor Fitzgerald attempted to soften the harshness of the ultimatum with false concern. "Of course, we hope it won't come to that. We're simply asking for reasonable cooperation in resolving this situation before it becomes more serious. Surely you can both see that continued defiance serves no one's interests." Jackson looked at Clara, seeing the fear and anger warring in her expression. He recognized that she was facing the destruction of everything she had worked to achieve, all because she had accepted his help during a life-threatening emergency. The injustice of the situation infuriated him, but he also understood the very real power that these people wielded in their small community. "I need time to consider your suggestions," Jackson said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Reverend Cumberland nodded with grim satisfaction. "Of course, but don't take too long, Mr. Hartwell. Every day this situation continues, the damage to community standards grows worse. We'll expect your decision by tomorrow evening." After the delegation left, Jackson and Clara stood in the parlor, both struggling to process the scope of the threat they faced. The sanctuary of the ranch had been violated by outside forces that seemed determined to destroy their newfound connection and return them to their separate, isolated existences. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for my presence here to threaten your position in the community. I should leave before this gets any worse." Jackson turned to face her, his expression intense. "Clara, if you leave now, they win. These people are using fear and social pressure to control behavior that threatens their authority. They don't care about morality or propriety, they care about power. But they can destroy us both," Clara replied, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Your business, my career, everything we've worked for could be gone because we refuse to submit to their version of proper behavior." Jackson moved closer to her, his voice soft but determined. "Then maybe it's time to find out whether love is stronger than social pressure. Maybe it's time to discover what we're really fighting for." The battle lines had been drawn, and Clara and Jackson found themselves facing a choice that would determine not just their own futures, but the very nature of their relationship. The system that governed social behavior in their world was arrayed against them, backed by economic power and moral authority that seemed insurmountable. But as they stood together in the fading light of the afternoon, both realized that something precious had been born between them during their days of isolation, something worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The question now was whether their courage would prove equal to the forces that sought to tear them apart. The morning after Reverend Cumberland's ultimatum dawned crisp and clear, the first day without snow in nearly a week. Jackson stood at his office window, watching the sun paint the Wyoming landscape in brilliant gold, while wrestling with decisions that would reshape his entire existence. The pristine beauty of the scene contrasted sharply with the turmoil in his mind, as he contemplated the forces arrayed against him and Clara. It was then that Jackson spotted an unexpected visitor approaching the ranch. A lone rider was making his way up the drive, moving with the confident ease of someone familiar with both horses and harsh terrain. As the figure drew closer, Jackson recognized Marcus Ironcloud, a Lakota man who had become one of the most respected guides and interpreters in the territory. Marcus was a man of perhaps 40 years, with weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing of what occurred around him. He had served as a bridge between the Native American tribes and the white settlers for over a decade, earning respect from both communities through his fairness, wisdom, and uncanny ability to find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Jackson met Marcus at the front door, genuinely pleased to see someone he considered a friend rather than another representative of social authority. "Marcus, what brings you out here? I thought you were guiding survey teams up in the Bighorn Mountains." Marcus dismounted with fluid grace, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "I finished that job early and heard interesting stories in town about your situation, Jackson. Thought it might be time for an old friend to pay a visit." Jackson gestured for Marcus to come inside, grateful for the presence of someone whose judgment he trusted and whose perspective might offer clarity. In the confusion that surrounded him, Marcus had always possessed an ability to see through social pretensions to the truth that lay beneath, and Jackson sensed that he would need such insight in the days ahead. "Coffee?" Jackson offered as they settled in his study. Marcus nodded, then got directly to the point. "Jackson, I've known you for 8 years. In all that time, I've watched you build this ranch through hard work and fair dealing. You've never cheated a business partner, never broken your word, and never treated any man differently because of his race or background. That's why what I'm hearing in town doesn't make sense." Jackson poured coffee for both of them, curious about what version of events had reached Marcus. "What exactly are people saying? Reverend Cumberland and his people are spreading stories about you corrupting an innocent young woman, taking advantage of her helplessness to satisfy your own desires. They're painting you as a predator and her as either a victim or a woman of loose morals, depending on who's telling the story." The crude characterization of his relationship with Clara infuriated Jackson, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And what do you think, Marcus?" Marcus studied Jackson's face with the careful attention of someone trained to read human nature. "I think that if you were the kind of man who would take advantage of a woman in distress, I would have seen signs of it during our years of friendship. I also think that Reverend Cumberland and his allies are more concerned with maintaining their control over this community than they are with morality or justice." The validation from someone whose opinion Jackson valued meant more than he had expected. For the first time since the confrontation with the town's moral authorities, Jackson felt that he was not facing the situation entirely alone. "Marcus, there's something you should know. I didn't just rescue Miss Whitfield from the storm. I've fallen in love with her. And I believe she feels the same way about me." Marcus nodded, as if this revelation confirmed something he had already suspected. "Love between a man and woman isn't a crime, Jackson, despite what some people seem to think. The question is what you're prepared to do about it." Before Jackson could respond, Clara appeared in the doorway of the study. She had heard voices and had come to investigate, not wanting to hide from whatever new challenge had arrived at the ranch. Her appearance provided Marcus with his first opportunity to assess the woman who had caused such turmoil in Cedar Falls. "Miss Whitfield," Jackson said, rising from his chair, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Ironcloud. Marcus, this is Clara Whitfield." Marcus stood and offered a respectful nod to Clara, his experienced eyes taking in her bearing, her expression, and the way she carried herself. What he saw was a woman of obvious intelligence and strength, someone who faced uncertainty with courage rather than seeking sympathy or advantage. "Mr. Ironcloud," Clara said with genuine warmth, "Jackson has spoken. Of you often. He holds you in high regard. The feeling is mutual, Miss Whitfield. Though I have to say, your presence here has certainly stirred up the hornet's nest in town." Clara's expression grew troubled. "I'm afraid my situation has created problems for Jackson that he doesn't deserve. I never intended for my presence here to damage his reputation or threaten his business interests." Marcus studied the interaction between Clara and Jackson, noting the obvious affection and respect that flowed between them. In his experience, genuine emotional connections were rare and precious, not something to be sacrificed to social prejudice or political convenience. "Miss Whitfield," Marcus said thoughtfully, "in my culture, we believe that when the spirits bring two people together during a time of great danger, it's a sign that their destinies are connected. The storm that nearly took your life also brought you to Jackson. Perhaps that's not an accident." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest at Marcus's words. Since arriving at the ranch, she had been struggling with guilt over the complications her presence had created, but Marcus's perspective offered a different way of understanding her situation. "Mr. Ironcloud," Clara said carefully, "do you believe it's possible for love to overcome the kind of social pressure we're facing?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering not just her question, but the larger implications of what was happening in Cedar Falls. "Miss Whitfield, I've seen love conquer hatred, prejudice, and even war, but I've also seen it destroyed by fear and social pressure when people aren't willing to fight for what they believe in." Jackson leaned forward in his chair, sensing that Marcus had more to say about their situation. "What are you thinking, Marcus?" "I'm thinking that you two aren't the only people in this territory who are tired of being told how to live their lives by self-appointed moral authorities. I'm also thinking that Reverend Cumberland and his allies might have made a mistake by pushing this too far." Clara looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "I mean that there are other people in Cedar Falls and the surrounding area who have their own reasons for resenting the moral reform society's interference in their lives. People who might be willing to stand with you if they thought there was a chance of success." Jackson felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. "Are you talking about organizing opposition to Cumberland and his allies?" "I'm talking about reminding this community that there are more ways to live a moral life than following Reverend Cumberland's narrow rules. I'm talking about people who believe in judging others by their actions rather than their compliance with social expectations." Marcus stood and moved to the window, looking out at the clear Wyoming sky. "Jackson, you've helped a lot of people over the years. Families whose ranches were failing, workers who needed jobs, business owners who needed fair loans. You've never asked for anything in return, but that doesn't mean people have forgotten your kindness." Clara felt her heart begin to race as she realized what Marcus was suggesting. "You think there are people who would be willing to support us publicly?" "I think there are people who would be willing to support the principle that love and kindness matter more than social conformity, but it would require courage from both of you. You'd have to be willing to fight openly rather than hiding or running away. Jackson stood and joined Marcus at the window, his mind racing through the implications of such a strategy. What did you have in mind? Marcus turned to face both of them, his expression serious but determined. There's going to be a community meeting tomorrow night at the schoolhouse. Reverend Cumberland called it to discuss moral standards and community values. He's expecting to use public pressure to force you into compliance with his demands. That sounds like walking into a trap, Clara said quietly. It would be, Marcus agreed, if you went alone and unprepared. But what if you didn't go alone? What if you had allies who were ready to speak on your behalf? Jackson felt excitement, building as he began to understand Marcus's strategy. You're talking about turning Cumberland's own meeting against him. I'm talking about giving the decent people of this community a chance to choose between fear and courage, between conformity and justice. But it would require both of you to tell your story honestly and let people judge for themselves. Clara felt a mixture of terror and hope at the prospect Marcus was describing. The idea of facing the entire community in public forum was terrifying. But it also offered the possibility of vindication and the chance to fight back against the forces that sought to destroy her future. Who would stand with us? Jackson asked. Marcus pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. I've already spoken to several people. Sarah Martinez, whose husband you helped when his freight business was failing. Thomas and Beth Coleman, whose son you saved from drowning last summer. Jim Hawkins, whose ranch you saved from foreclosure. Elena Santos, whose family you protected when they faced discrimination from some of the town's less tolerant citizens. As Marcus read the names, Jackson felt a growing sense of amazement. He had helped these people during various crises over the years, never expecting anything in return, and certainly never imagining that such acts of kindness would create a network of allies during his own time of need. There are others, Marcus continued, people who are tired of being told how to think and feel by a small group of self-appointed moral guardians, people who believe that actions matter more than appearances, and that love deserves protection rather than persecution. Clara felt tears of gratitude welling in her eyes as she realized that she and Jackson were not as alone as they had believed. These people would really be willing to stand up to Reverend Cumberland and his allies? They would if they knew they weren't standing alone, Marcus replied. Fear is powerful, but it loses much of its strength when people stand together. Cumberland's authority depends on people believing that everyone agrees with him. Once that illusion is shattered, his power begins to crumble. Jackson moved to stand beside Clara, taking her hand in a gesture that felt natural despite the uncertainty of their situation. What would we need to do? Marcus outlined his strategy with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating complex political and social situations. First, you need to decide whether you're willing to commit to each other publicly. This only works if people can see that what you have is real love, not a casual attraction or temporary infatuation. Clara and Jackson looked into each other's eyes, both recognizing that Marcus was asking them to make a declaration that would change their lives forever. The love that had grown between them during their days of isolation would have to be proclaimed before their entire community, making them vulnerable to judgment and potential ridicule. I love Clara, Jackson said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was declaring. I want to marry her and build a life together regardless of what anyone else thinks about our relationship. Clara felt her heart soar at Jackson's public declaration of his feelings. I love Jackson too, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. He saved my life and showed me what real kindness and courage look like. I would be honored To be his wife, Marcus nodded with satisfaction, having seen what he needed to see in their responses. Good. People can sense genuine emotion, and they'll respond to it if given the chance. Now for the second part of the strategy. Marcus explained that each of their allies would speak at the community meeting, sharing stories of Jackson's character and contributions to the community. They would challenge the narrative that Reverend Cumberland was trying to create, presenting evidence of Jackson's integrity and Clara's courage. But most importantly, Marcus said, you'll have the chance to tell your own story, to explain how you met, why you fell in love, and what you want to build together. You'll give people the opportunity to choose between fear and hope, between judgment and acceptance. Clara felt a surge of determination as she contemplated the battle ahead. And if we lose, if the community chooses to support Cumberland's version of morality, Marcus's expression grew grave, then you'll know that this isn't the place where your love can flourish, and you'll have to find somewhere else to build your life together. But at least you'll have fought for what you believe in, rather than surrendering without a battle. Jackson squeezed Clara's hand, feeling her strength and courage flowing through the connection between them. We'll do it, he said firmly. We'll tell our story and trust the community to judge us fairly. As the three of them spent the afternoon planning their strategy for the community meeting, Clara and Jackson felt a transformation taking place within themselves. They were no longer isolated individuals facing overwhelming social pressure. They had become part of a larger movement that challenged the very foundations of moral authority in their community. The unexpected alliance that Marcus had helped forge would be tested in the crucible of public opinion. But for the first time, since the crisis began, Clara and Jackson felt that victory was possible. Love had found champions, and justice had found a voice that could not be silenced by fear or prejudice. The battle for their future was about to begin, and they would face it together, supported by allies they had never expected and armed with. A truth that could not be denied. Tomorrow night would determine whether love could indeed conquer the forces that sought to destroy it. Word of the growing resistance to Reverend Cumberland's moral crusade spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, reaching the ears of powerful interests who had far more at stake than simple social propriety. By noon, on the day before the community meeting, it became clear that Jackson and Clara had inadvertently challenged forces much larger and more dangerous than small-town gossip. The first sign of escalation came in the form of Nathaniel Blackwood, Mrs. Prudence Blackwood's husband and president of the Territorial Banking Consortium. Blackwood was a man who wielded financial power like a scalpel, using credit and debt to control the economic destiny of entire communities. His bank held mortgages on half the businesses in Cedar Falls and had the power to destroy livelihoods. With a single decision, Blackwood arrived at Jackson's ranch, accompanied by two well-dressed men who introduced themselves as representatives of the Colorado Mining Syndicate and the Union Pacific Railroad. Their presence transformed what had been a local social dispute into something approaching a business conspiracy, with Jackson's considerable wealth and influence suddenly under coordinated attack. "Hartwell," Blackwood said without preamble as they gathered in Jackson's study, "I think you've misunderstood the seriousness of your situation. This isn't just about social propriety anymore. Your defiance of community standards is threatening business relationships that extend far beyond Cedar Falls." Jackson studied the three men, recognizing the cold calculation in their eyes. These were not moral crusaders concerned with propriety. They were business predators who saw opportunity in his current vulnerability. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nathaniel?" Jackson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Harrison Webb, the railroad representative, pulled out a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents. "Mr. Hartwell, the Union Pacific has been reconsidering our shipping contracts with ranchers in this territory. Companies that maintain questionable reputations pose risks to our corporate image that we can no longer afford to ignore. The threat was unmistakable. Jackson's cattle operation depended on railroad transport to get his beef to markets in Chicago and Denver. Without those shipping contracts, his ranch would be reduced to supplying only local customers, devastating his profits and threatening the employment of dozens of ranch hands. Charles Morrison from the mining syndicate leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying the quiet menace of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Furthermore, the territorial legislature is currently considering new regulations on land use and water rights. Representatives who support moral reform initiatives tend to receive more favorable consideration when such legislation is drafted. Clara, who had been listening from the adjoining room, felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the scope of the forces arrayed against them. These men weren't just threatening Jackson's social standing. They were preparing to destroy his entire business empire as punishment for his refusal to conform to their demands. Blackwood spread several documents across Jackson's desk, each one representing a different aspect of the financial web that could strangle Jackson's operations. Your ranch operates on credit like any large business, Jackson. Equipment loans, seasonal operating capital, expansion financing, all of it flows through banks that value stable, respectable clients. Jackson examined the papers, recognizing invoices, loan agreements, and credit arrangements that formed the financial foundation of his success. The message was clear. Conform or face economic destruction on a scale that would make social ostracism seem trivial by comparison. "What do you want?" Jackson asked, though he already suspected the answer. Webb consulted his notes with bureaucratic precision. "Simple compliance with community standards. Miss Whitfield leaves town immediately and permanently. You issue a public statement acknowledging that your behavior was inappropriate and pledge to conduct yourself according to proper moral guidelines in the future." Morrison added his own conditions with the casual cruelty of someone who had destroyed other lives without regret. "You'll also need to make a substantial contribution to the Moral Reform Society to demonstrate your commitment to proper values. Say $50,000 to fund their expansion throughout the territory." The demand for what amounted to blood money infuriated Jackson, but he forced himself to remain calm while considering his options. $50,000 was a significant sum, but more importantly, paying it would legitimize the moral reform, society's authority, and provide them with resources to terrorize other communities throughout Wyoming. "And if I refuse?" Jackson asked, though the answer was already apparent from the document spread across his desk. Blackwood's smile was thin and predatory. "Then you'll discover how quickly a man's fortune can disappear when the business community loses confidence in his judgment. Railroad contracts cancelled, bank loans called in, credit arrangements terminated. Within 6 months, the mighty double. Diamond Ranch would be nothing but a memory." Clara could no longer remain silent in the face of such calculated cruelty. She entered the study with her head held high, meeting the hostile gazes of the 3 men with steady defiance. "Gentlemen," she said with icy politeness, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. It seems you've confused moral authority with criminal extortion." Morrison's face flushed with anger at the accusation. "Young lady, you're hardly in a position to lecture anyone about morality. Your shameless behavior has created this entire crisis." "My shameless behavior?" Clara replied, her voice rising with indignation. "I nearly died of exposure while traveling to a job where I planned to save lives and heal suffering. Mr. Hartwell rescued me from certain death and provided shelter during a blizzard that made travel impossible. If you consider such Christian charity shameful, I question your understanding of moral behavior." Webb attempted to reassert control over the conversation. Miss Whitfield, surely you can see that continued residence in an unmarried man's home creates appearances that reflect poorly on everyone involved. The sensible course is to relocate to more appropriate accommodations until your travel arrangements can be completed. Clara felt her nursing training assert itself as she recognized the manipulative language being used against her. Mr. Webb, I'm a trained medical professional who has dealt with life and death situations that would reduce you to panic. I'm quite capable of determining what constitutes appropriate behavior in emergency circumstances. Blackwood's patience was clearly wearing thin as he realized that neither Jackson nor Clara was responding to intimidation in the expected manner. Miss Whitfield, you seem to be laboring under the delusion that your professional credentials provide some protection against social consequences. Let me disabuse you of that notion immediately. He pulled another document from his briefcase, this one bearing the letterhead of the Territorial Medical Board. This is a formal complaint questioning your moral fitness to practice nursing in Wyoming Territory. Similar complaints will be filed with medical boards throughout the West, effectively ending your career regardless of where you attempt to relocate. The threat struck Clara like a physical blow. Years of training, sacrifice, and dedication could be wiped out by coordinated lies and character assassination. The medical profession was still struggling to establish itself as respectable for women, and accusations of moral impropriety could destroy a career before it truly began. Furthermore, Morrison added with obvious satisfaction, we've taken the liberty of contacting your family in Boston. Your father's congregation will be receiving detailed reports about your behavior here, along with suggestions that a minister who cannot control his own daughter's moral conduct might be unsuitable for guiding other families. Clara felt tears of rage threatening at the corners of her eyes as she realized these men were prepared to destroy not just her own future, but her family's livelihood as well. Her father's ministerial career depended on maintaining the respect of his congregation, and scandal involving his daughter could cost him his position and their family's security. Jackson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor as fury finally overcame his self-control. That's enough. You've made your point, gentlemen. Now get off my property before I forget that you're guests in my home. Blackwood gathered his documents with deliberate slowness, clearly savoring the fear and anger he had provoked. Jackson, you have until tomorrow evening's community meeting to announce your compliance with our terms. After that, the consequences will be swift and permanent. After the three men left, Jackson and Clara stood in the study surrounded by the wreckage of their carefully laid plans. The alliance that Marcus had helped forge seemed pitifully inadequate against the coordinated assault of territorial business interests backed by unlimited financial resources. They're going to destroy everything, Clara said quietly, her voice thick with despair. Your ranch, my career, my family's reputation, all because we dared to fall in love. Jackson moved to her side, taking her hands in his own, despite the trembling that betrayed his own fear. Clara, we knew this wouldn't be easy, but we can't let them win through intimidation and threats. Jackson, be realistic, Clara replied, pulling away from him in her anguish. These aren't small-town busybodies trying to enforce social customs. These are powerful men with the resources to carry out their threats. They can destroy both of us without breaking a sweat. The sound of hoofbeats outside interrupted their conversation, and both Jackson and Clara felt their hearts sink at the prospect of facing another wave of threats and ultimatums. But when Jackson looked out the window, he saw Marcus Ironcloud approaching at a gallop, his expression urgent in a way that suggested news of critical importance. Marcus dismounted quickly and hurried toward the house, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. Jackson met him at the door, immediately sensing that their situation had taken another dramatic turn. "Jackson, Clara," Marcus said breathlessly, "we need to talk immediately. I've just learned something that changes everything about tomorrow night's meeting." They gathered quickly in the parlor, where Marcus pulled out a telegram that bore the official seal of the territorial governor's office. "This arrived at the telegraph office an hour ago. It's addressed to Reverend Cumberland, but the operator is a friend of mine who thought I should see it before it's delivered." Jackson took the telegram and read it aloud, his voice growing more astonished with each word. "Reverend Cumberland, stop. Congressional investigation into territorial business practices requires immediate suspension of all intimidation activities. Stop. Federal authorities en route to investigate complaints of extortion and conspiracy. Stop. Advise all associates to cease controversial activities pending investigation. Stop. Governor Maxwell." Clara felt her heart begin to race as the implications of the telegram sank in. "Federal authorities, someone reported the extortion to Congress?" Marcus nodded grimly. "It gets better. I also learned that Nathaniel Blackwood, Harrison Webb, and Charles Morrison have been under federal investigation for months. Apparently, they've used these same tactics in other territories, combining moral reform movements with business extortion to control local economies." Jackson felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. "Are you saying that what happened here today was part of a larger criminal conspiracy?" "I'm saying that you and Clara accidentally walked into the middle of a federal investigation that's been building for over a year," Marcus replied. "These men have been using moral reform societies as fronts for organized extortion throughout the West. What they tried to do to you today, they've already done to dozens of other business owners and community leaders." Clara sank into a chair as the full scope of the situation became clear. "So tomorrow night's meeting just became a trap for the trappers," Marcus said with grim satisfaction. "Federal marshals will be in Cedar Falls by tomorrow afternoon, and they'll be very interested in attending a public gathering where known extortion conspirators are expected to make threats against local citizens." Jackson moved to the window, looking out at the landscape that had nearly been taken from him by organized criminal activity disguised as moral crusading. "Marcus, how did the federal authorities learn about what was happening here?" Marcus smiled for the first time since arriving with the telegram. "It seems that someone in town has been documenting these threats and extortion attempts for months. Someone who recognized the pattern from previous investigations and took it upon themselves to contact federal authorities." "Who?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell," Marcus replied, watching Jackson's face for recognition of the name. Jackson's eyes widened with amazement. "Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell? My cousin Elizabeth? The one who went to medical school back east?" "The same one," Marcus confirmed. "She returned to Wyoming Territory last month to establish a medical practice, but what she found instead was a systematic pattern of extortion and intimidation. Being a woman trying to establish herself in a male-dominated profession made her particularly sensitive to the tactics being used against anyone who challenged local power structures." Clara felt a wave of gratitude toward this unknown ally who had risked her own safety to expose the criminal conspiracy that threatened their love. "Where is she now?" "She's been staying in Cheyenne, coordinating with federal investigators while documenting evidence of the extortion conspiracy. But she'll be at tomorrow night's meeting, along with federal marshals who have arrest warrants for Blackwood, Webb, Morrison, and several other members of their organization." Jackson felt the weight of fear and despair lifting from his shoulders, as he realized that their love story was about to become part of a much larger victory against organized corruption. "So tomorrow night, Reverend Cumberland's meeting, is going to be interrupted by federal arrests that will expose the Moral Reform Society as a front for criminal extortion, Marcus said with obvious satisfaction. And you and Clara will finally have the chance to tell your love story without the threat of economic destruction hanging over your heads. As the three of them spent the evening planning for what would now be a very different kind of community meeting, Clara and Jackson felt the transformation of their situation from desperate last stand to triumphant vindication. The forces that had seemed so overwhelming just hours before were about to be revealed as criminals whose power depended on deception and fear. The escalation they had feared would destroy them was instead about to destroy their enemies, clearing the way for a love story that would indeed make history, not just in Cedar Falls, but throughout the American West, as an example of courage, triumphing over corruption and justice prevailing over organized crime. The afternoon before the community meeting brought an unexpected procession of visitors to the Double Diamond Ranch, each arrival marking another crack in the wall of silence and fear that had kept Cedar Falls under the control of its self-appointed moral authorities. What began as a trickle of nervous supporters had become a steady stream of townspeople who seemed to have discovered their courage all at once. The first to arrive was Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 30s whose determined expression belied the trembling in her hands as she approached Jackson's front door. Sarah had been widowed 2 years earlier when her husband died in a freight wagon accident, leaving her with 3 young children and a failing business that provided the only income for her family. "Mr. Hartwell," Sarah said when Jackson answered her knock, "I hope you don't mind me coming by unannounced. I heard about what's been happening and I needed to tell you something important." Jackson welcomed her inside, where Clara was waiting with coffee and the kind of warm hospitality that seemed to naturally flow between women who recognized strength in each other. Sarah accepted the refreshment gratefully, but her urgency was apparent in every gesture. "Mr. Hartwell, Miss Whitfield," Sarah began, "people in town are saying terrible things about both of you, but I know better. When my husband died and the freight business was failing, you didn't just give me a loan to keep it running. You helped me reorganize the routes, taught me how to negotiate with suppliers, and made sure I understood every aspect of the business so I could succeed on my own." Clara felt her heart warm as she listened to Sarah's testimony about Jackson's character. The man who had rescued her from the blizzard had apparently been rescuing people in various ways for years, using his wealth and influence to lift others up rather than tear them down. "But there's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Yesterday, Mr. Blackwood came to see me. He said that if I supported you at tonight's meeting, the bank would call in the loan on my business. He said they'd make sure I lost everything and that my children would have to go to the orphanage." Jackson felt fury building in his chest as he realized that the extortion conspiracy had extended far beyond his own situation. "Sarah, did he threaten anyone else?" "Everyone," Sarah replied, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "He's been visiting every family that you've helped over the years, threatening to destroy them if they speak up for you. The Colemans, the Hawkins, the Santos family, all of them received the same message." Clara moved to sit beside Sarah, offering the comfort of feminine solidarity in the face of masculine intimidation. "Sarah, you don't have to risk your family's security for us. We understand that you have to protect your children." Sarah straightened in her chair, her expression growing resolute despite her fears. "Miss Whitfield, my children are going to grow up in this community. I want them to live in a place where good people help each other, not where bullies use fear to control everyone. If I don't stand up now, what kind of example am I setting for them?" Before Jackson could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention to the window. A group of 5 riders was making its way up the drive, and Jackson recognized them as some of the families that Marcus had mentioned as potential allies. Thomas and Beth Coleman rode in the lead, followed by Jim Hawkins and his teenage son, and, bringing up the rear, was Elena Santos with her eldest daughter. Each face bore the same expression of determined courage, mixed with obvious fear that Sarah had displayed. And Jackson realized that his community was experiencing a collective awakening to the reality of their situation. As the group assembled, in Jackson's parlor, the stories they shared painted a picture of systematic intimidation that went far beyond anything Jackson had imagined. Each family had received threats tailored to their specific vulnerabilities, demonstrating a level of coordination and planning that confirmed the federal investigation's findings about organized criminal activity. Jim Hawkins, a grizzled rancher, whose weathered hands spoke of decades of hard work, cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "Jackson, they came after my boy. Said if I supported you tonight, they'd make sure he didn't get accepted to the Territorial University. Boy's been working toward that scholarship for 3 years. Elena Santos added her own account of intimidation. They threatened to report my family to immigration authorities, claiming our papers weren't in order. We've been citizens for 5 years, but they said they could make life very difficult for us, regardless." Beth Coleman's voice shook with emotion as she described the threats against her family. "They said they'd spread rumors about our son's drowning incident, claiming that Jackson was somehow responsible for putting him in danger rather than saving his life. They wanted to turn his heroism into something shameful." Clara listened to each account with growing amazement at the scope of the conspiracy and the courage of these families who were willing to risk everything to stand up for what was right. These were not wealthy or influential people. They were ordinary families whose security depended on the goodwill of the same business interests that were now threatening them. "Why are you all here?" Clara asked gently. "With so much at stake for your families, why are you willing to take these risks?" Elena Santos answered for the group, her accented English carrying the authority of someone who had faced greater challenges than small-town intimidation. "Miss Whitfield, my family came to this country to escape people who used fear to control others. We know what happens when good people remain silent while bullies take power. It doesn't end with one family or one couple. It grows until no one is safe." Thomas Coleman nodded agreement. "Besides, we've been talking among ourselves, and we think there might be more of us than they realize. The Moral Reform Society makes a lot of noise, but they don't represent everyone in this community." Jim Hawkins leaned forward in his chair, his expression growing more confident. "Jackson, you remember old Pete Morrison, the train conductor? He's been talking to passengers and railroad workers, and he says there are people throughout the territory who are tired of being told how to live by these moral reform societies." The mention of Pete Morrison surprised Jackson. The conductor had seemed like a simple railroad employee, but apparently he had been observing and thinking about the larger implications of what was happening in communities throughout Wyoming. "Territory." Sarah Martinez spoke up again, her voice stronger now that she was surrounded by others who shared her concerns. "Mr. Hartwell, Miss Whitfield, there's something else you should know. Some of us have been meeting quietly, trying to understand what's really happening here. We think the Moral Reform Society is just the visible part of something much larger." "What do you mean?" Clara asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Beth Coleman pulled a folded newspaper clipping from her handbag. "We found this article in a Denver newspaper from last month. It describes the same pattern of moral reform societies being used to control business and politics in Colorado mining towns, the same people using the same methods." Jackson examined the newspaper clipping, recognizing several of the names mentioned in connection with the Colorado situation. The evidence of a coordinated conspiracy was becoming overwhelming. confirming everything that Marcus had learned about the federal investigation. "There's more," Thomas Coleman added. "My brother lives in Cheyenne, and he says there's been talk in the territorial legislature about investigations into business practices throughout Wyoming. Apparently, some powerful people have been using moral reform as cover for extortion and corruption." Elena Santos nodded vigorously. "My cousin works for the territorial government, and she says federal marshals have been asking questions about moral reform societies in several communities. They think it's all connected to the same criminal organization." Clara felt a surge of excitement as she realized that the community awakening happening in Cedar Falls was part of a much larger movement throughout the territory. People everywhere were beginning to recognize the pattern of intimidation and control that had been disguised as moral reform. "So what do we do?" Sarah Martinez asked. "How do we stand up to people who have the power to destroy our livelihoods?" It was then that Jackson made the decision that would transform not just his own situation, but the entire dynamic of power in Cedar Falls. "We tell the truth," he said simply. "We stand together, and we tell the truth about what's been happening." "Here." Jackson moved to the center of the room, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Tonight's meeting was supposed to be about intimidating us into submission. Instead, it's going to be about exposing the truth about organized criminal activity disguised as moral reform." Clara felt her heart race as she understood what Jackson was proposing. "You want to confront them publicly, in front of the entire community?" "I want to give this community the chance to choose between fear and courage," Jackson replied. "Between being controlled by criminals or standing up for justice and real moral values." Jim Hawkins stood up, his weathered face breaking into a determined smile. "Count me in, Jackson. It's time these bullies learned that there are more of us than there are of them." One by one, each member of the group voiced their commitment to standing with Jackson and Clara at the community meeting. Sarah Martinez, despite her fears for her children's future, declared that she would rather risk everything fighting for justice than live safely under criminal control. Elena Santos spoke for her entire family when she said, "We came to America to be free. Freedom isn't something you receive as a gift, it's something you fight for and protect." As the afternoon progressed, more families arrived at the ranch. Word had spread through the community's informal networks that a stand was being made against the forces that had terrorized them for so long. Each new arrival brought stories of intimidation and threats, but also stories of quiet resistance and growing determination to fight back. By evening, Jackson's parlor was filled with over 30 people representing a cross-section of Cedar Falls society that the moral reform leadership had never anticipated. These were not just the families that Jackson had helped directly. They were people who had been watching and waiting for someone to provide leadership in the fight against organized intimidation. Marcus Ironcloud arrived as the impromptu gathering was reaching its peak, bringing with him news that would transform their planned resistance into something approaching a celebration of justice. "Friends," he announced to the assembled crowd, "I've just received word that federal marshals arrived in Cedar Falls an hour ago. They're currently at the hotel, preparing for tonight's meeting." The news sent a wave of excitement through the gathered families, but Marcus held up his hand for continued attention. "There's more. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell is with them, and she's brought documentation of criminal activity that extends far beyond what we suspected. The conspiracy involves not just local business interests, but territorial politicians and federal officials who have been taking bribes to ignore the extortion activities." Lara felt tears of relief beginning to flow as she realized that their love story had accidentally uncovered a criminal conspiracy that threatened democratic institutions throughout the American West. "Does this mean it's really over? That we're Safe. Marcus smiled with satisfaction. It means that tonight's meeting is going to be very different from what Reverend Cumberland and his allies have planned. Instead of intimidating you into submission, they're going to find themselves facing federal arrest warrants. Jackson looked around the room, at the faces of his neighbors and friends, seeing courage where there had once been fear, determination, where there had once been resignation. Then let's go to that meeting, he said firmly. Let's give this community the chance to see what real moral courage looks like. As the families prepared to leave for the schoolhouse where the community meeting would be held, Clara felt a transformation taking place not just within herself, but throughout the entire gathering. These people had discovered that they were not powerless victims of organized intimidation. They were citizens with rights and the courage to defend them. The community awakening that had begun with a few nervous visitors to Jackson's ranch had become a movement that would reshape not just Cedar Falls, but the entire territory. Love had indeed proven stronger than fear, but more importantly, it had revealed the power that ordinary people possessed when they stood together against organized corruption. Tonight would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another, as a community that had been controlled by criminal conspiracy would finally free itself through the simple but revolutionary act of choosing courage over fear, truth over intimidation, and justice over organized crime. The Cedar Falls schoolhouse had never witnessed an evening quite like this one. By 7 o'clock, every seat was filled and people lined the walls, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that crackled with tension. Reverend Cumberland stood at the front of the room, his austere black clothing and severe expression commanding attention as he prepared to deliver what he believed would be the final blow against Jackson and Clara's defiance of moral authority. What Cumberland didn't know was that seated inconspicuously throughout the crowd were 3 federal marshals, each armed with arrest warrants and equipped with enough evidence to dismantle the criminal conspiracy that had masqueraded as moral reform. Marshal William Hayes, a veteran law enforcement officer with 20 years of experience investigating organized crime, watched the proceedings with the patient intensity of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jackson and Clara entered the schoolhouse together, their hands clasped in a gesture of unity that sent murmurs rippling through the assembled crowd. Clara wore her finest dress, the deep blue wool that had seemed so inadequate against the Wyoming winter, but now served as armor against social assault. Jackson walked beside her with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to hide and everything to fight for. Behind them came the coalition of families that had gathered at the ranch, their faces reflecting a mixture of nervous determination and quiet courage. Sarah Martinez held her head high, despite the whispered comments from some of the town's more judgmental residents. The Coleman family took seats near the front, Thomas's arm around his wife's shoulders in a gesture of protective solidarity. Elena Santos and her daughter found places near the back, their presence adding an element of cultural diversity that clearly made some of the Moral Reform Society members uncomfortable. Reverend Cumberland called the meeting to order, with the ceremonial gravity of someone conducting a trial rather than a community discussion. "Citizens of Cedar Falls," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of decades in the pulpit, "we gather tonight to address a moral crisis that threatens the very foundation of our community's values." Mrs. Prudence Blackwood sat in the front row, her elaborate hat and expensive clothing marking her as the social arbiter whose approval could make or break reputations. Beside her, Dr. Silas Thornton fidgeted nervously, his alcohol-scented breath and trembling hands betraying the physical deterioration that had made him unsuitable for serious medical practice. "Before us sits a couple whose behavior has scandalized our community," Cumberland continued, gesturing toward Jackson and Clara with theatrical disdain. an unmarried man and woman who have flouted the sacred conventions of proper moral conduct, choosing personal gratification over community standards. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Jackson's steady presence beside her provided strength against the verbal assault. She had faced medical emergencies that required split-second decisions under enormous pressure. She would not be intimidated by the sanctimonious pronouncements of a man whose moral authority rested on fear rather than genuine virtue. Cumberland warmed to his theme, his voice rising with evangelical fervor. This is not merely about two individuals who have lost their way. This is about whether Cedar Falls will continue to uphold the moral standards that separate civilized society from chaos and degradation. It was then that Jackson stood, his movement causing a hush to fall over the assembled crowd. He had not asked permission to speak, had not waited for Cumberland's invitation, and his simple act of rising represented a fundamental challenge to the authority that the Reverend had wielded, unchallenged for years. "Reverend Cumberland," Jackson said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent schoolhouse, "before you continue with your moral pronouncements, I think this community deserves to hear the truth about what's really been happening in Cedar Falls." Cumberland's face flushed with anger at the interruption. "Mr. Hartwell, you are out of order. This meeting is being conducted according to proper procedures, and you will wait your turn to speak." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Jackson replied calmly. "You see, Reverend, the Moral Reform Society that you represent has been exposed as a front for criminal extortion. Your proper procedures are actually methods of organized intimidation designed to control this community through fear." A gasp went up from the crowd as Jackson's accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Cumberland's face went white, then red, as he struggled to maintain his composure in the face of such a direct challenge to his authority. "How dare you?" Cumberland sputtered. "Your shameless behavior has clearly affected your judgment, Mr. Hartwell. These wild accusations are nothing more than desperate attempts to deflect attention from your own moral failures." Clara rose to stand beside Jackson, her nursing training asserting itself as she recognized the symptoms of panic in Cumberland's demeanor. The Reverend's elevated breathing, perspiration, and agitated movements suggested a man who was losing control of a situation he had expected to dominate. "Reverend Cumberland," Clara said with the calm authority she had learned in hospital wards, "perhaps you could explain why Mr. Nathaniel Blackwood threatened to destroy my family's livelihood in Boston if I didn't leave town immediately. Is Christian charity now considered a crime in your version of moral behavior?" The mention of specific threats against Clara's family caused another stir in the crowd. Many of the assembled citizens had not heard the details of the intimidation campaign, and Clara's revelation provided their first glimpse into the scope of the conspiracy. Mrs. Blackwood stood abruptly, her face contorted with indignation. "Young lady, how dare you impugn my husband's character with such outrageous lies? Nathaniel is a respected businessman who would never engage in the kind of behavior you're describing." It was Sarah Martinez who provided the response that transformed the evening from moral theater into criminal exposure. Standing with visible effort to overcome her fear, Sarah addressed the crowd in a voice that shook but did not waver. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah said, "your husband came to my home yesterday and threatened to foreclose on my business loan if I supported Mr. Hartwell and Miss Whitfield tonight. He said he would make sure my children ended up in the orphanage if I didn't keep quiet about Mr. Hartwell's kindness to my family." The schoolhouse erupted in shocked conversation as Sarah's testimony provided concrete evidence of the intimidation campaign. Thomas Coleman immediately stood to add his own account of threats, followed by Jim Hawkins and Elena Santos, each family adding their voice to a chorus of testimony about systematic extortion disguised as moral reform. Cumberland raised his hands. for silence, his face now showing clear signs of panic as he realized that his carefully orchestrated meeting was spiraling completely out of his control. These are obviously coordinated lies designed to deflect attention from the real moral crisis facing our community. It was at this moment that Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell made her entrance, accompanied by Marshal Hayes and 2 other federal officers. Elizabeth was a woman in her early 30s, with the confident bearing of someone who had fought for her place in the male-dominated medical profession and emerged victorious. Her arrival caused a sensation in the crowd, particularly among those who recognized her as Jackson's cousin, Reverend Cumberland, Marshal Hayes announced in a voice that carried absolute authority. "I'm afraid this meeting is about to take a very different direction than you planned." Cumberland's face went ashen as he recognized the federal badges worn by the 3 men. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a private community meeting and you have no authority here." Marshal Hayes produced a leather folder containing official documents. "Actually, Reverend, we have considerable authority here. I'm Marshal William Hayes, and I have federal arrest warrants for several individuals who are present tonight." Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell stepped forward, her medical bag in one hand and a thick portfolio of documents in the other. "Citizens of Cedar Falls," she announced. "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, and I've spent the past 6 months documenting a criminal conspiracy that has used moral reform societies as fronts for extortion throughout Wyoming Territory. The revelation that a federal investigation had been underway sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd." Cumberland looked around desperately for support, but found that even his closest allies were beginning to distance themselves from him as the implications of federal involvement became clear. "For months," Dr. Hartwell continued, "federal investigators have been tracking a criminal organization that combines religious rhetoric with business intimidation to control local economies. The so-called Moral Reform Society here in Cedar Falls is just one branch of a conspiracy that extends throughout the American West." Marshal Hayes consulted his warrant folder with bureaucratic precision. "Nathaniel Blackwood, you are under arrest for extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of federal racketeering statutes." As he spoke, one of the other marshals moved through the crowd toward where Blackwood sat in stunned silence. "This is outrageous," Mrs. Blackwood shrieked as her husband was placed in handcuffs. "Nathaniel is a respected businessman. This is obviously some kind of mistake." "Harrison Webb and Charles Morrison," Marshal Hayes continued, "you are also under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and bribery of federal officials." The 2 men, who had been sitting near the back of the schoolhouse, apparently hoping to avoid notice, were quickly apprehended by the waiting marshals. Dr. Thornton attempted to slip out a side door, but was intercepted by a federal officer who had been positioned there specifically to prevent such escapes. "Dr. Silas Thornton, you are under arrest for filing false medical reports and conspiracy to commit fraud." As the arrests proceeded, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell addressed the stunned crowd with the authority of someone who had risked her own safety to expose criminal activity. "Citizens of Cedar Falls, what you have witnessed tonight is the result of courage shown by ordinary people who refuse to be intimidated by organized crime." She gestured toward Jackson and Clara, who stood together in the center of the schoolhouse, surrounded by the families who had found the courage to support them. Mr. Jackson Hartwell and Miss Clara Whitfield became the focal point of this investigation, not because they violated any moral standards, but because their love story threatened a criminal conspiracy that depended on fear and isolation to maintain control. Cumberland made one last, desperate attempt to salvage his authority. "This is all a misunderstanding. The Moral Reform Society was created to protect community values, not to engage in criminal activity." Marshal Hayes consulted another document from his folder, Reverend Cumberland, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit extortion and aiding a criminal enterprise. Your Moral Reform Society has been identified as the primary recruitment and coordination mechanism for criminal activity throughout this territory. As Cumberland was led away in handcuffs, his austere authority crumbling in the face of federal justice, Clara felt tears of relief streaming down her face. The man who had threatened to destroy her reputation and career had been revealed as a criminal whose moral righteousness was nothing more than a mask for organized crime. Jackson addressed the crowd, his voice carrying new authority born of vindication and justice. Citizens of Cedar Falls, tonight we have learned that standing up for love and truth is not just a personal choice, but a civic duty. The criminals who tried to control us through fear have been exposed, and our community is free to choose its own path forward. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell approached Jackson and Clara, her expression reflecting both professional satisfaction and personal joy. "Cousin Jackson," she said warmly, "I'm sorry it took so long to expose what was happening here. But I'm proud that your courage to protect Miss Whitfield helped bring down a criminal conspiracy that threatened democratic institutions throughout the West." Clara embraced Elizabeth with the gratitude of one professional woman to another. "Dr. Hartwell, how did you know what was happening here?" Elizabeth smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose careful investigation had achieved justice. "I've been tracking this criminal organization for months, documenting their activities in multiple territories. When I learned that they were targeting my cousin, I knew it was time to coordinate with federal authorities to shut them down permanently. As the federal marshals completed their arrests and the stunned crowd began to disperse, Jackson and Clara found themselves surrounded by the families who had risked everything to support them. Sarah Martinez, her children clinging to her skirts, approached with tears of gratitude in her eyes. "Mr. Hartwell, Miss Whitfield," Sarah said, "thank you for giving us the courage to stand up for what's right. My children will grow up in a community where love and kindness matter more than fear and intimidation." Elena Santos spoke for many of the assembled families when she said, "Tonight we learned that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they stand together for justice. This is what America is supposed to be about." As the evening wound down and the last of the federal officers departed with their prisoners, Jackson and Clara stood together outside the schoolhouse under a canopy of Wyoming stars. The battle that had begun with a blizzard and a rescue had ended with the exposure of organized crime and the triumph of love over fear. "Clara," Jackson said softly, taking her hands in his, "will you marry me? Not because we have to in order to satisfy social expectations, but because I love you and want to build a life together based on the courage and truth we've discovered in each other." Clara looked into Jackson's eyes, seeing not just the man who had saved her from the storm, but the partner who had stood with her against organized intimidation and emerged victorious through shared courage. "Yes, Jackson," she replied, her voice strong with conviction. "I will marry you, and together we'll help build a community where love conquers fear and truth defeats deception." Their kiss under the starlit Wyoming sky marked not just the beginning of their life together, but the dawn of a new era for Cedar Falls. An era where justice had triumphed over corruption and love had indeed made history. 6 months after the dramatic arrests at the Cedar Falls schoolhouse, the Wyoming Territory had become a very different place. The wedding of Jackson Hartwell and Clara Whitfield, celebrated on a brilliant spring morning in May of 1888, marked not just the union of two hearts, but the culmination of a transformation that had reshaped the very foundations of frontier society. The ceremony took place not in Reverend Cumberland's former church, which had been shuttered following his conviction and imprisonment, but in a newly constructed community center that had been built through the collective efforts of families throughout Cedar Falls. The building itself represented a revolutionary concept, a public space owned and governed by the entire community rather than controlled by religious or business authorities. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had agreed to officiate the wedding, her medical degree from Johns Hopkins University having been supplemented by ordination as a minister through a progressive seminary that recognized both her intellectual capabilities and her commitment to social justice. Her presence at the altar represented another breakthrough in a territory that was rapidly becoming known for its enlightened attitudes toward women's rights and professional equality. The guest list for the wedding read like a roster of democratic transformation. Sarah Martinez sat in the front row with her 3 children, her freight business now thriving as part of a cooperative network that had emerged to challenge the monopolistic practices of the former business conspiracy. The Colemans, Hawkins, and Santos families occupied places of honor, their courage during the crisis having established them as respected community leaders. But perhaps most significant was the presence of dignitaries from throughout the American West who had come to witness what newspapers were calling the wedding that changed history. Territorial Governor Robert Maxwell attended, along with federal investigators who had used the Cedar Falls case as a model for dismantling similar criminal conspiracies in Colorado, Montana, and New Mexico. As Clara walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk that had been a wedding gift from the women of Cedar Falls, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened young nurse who had nearly frozen to death at a train station had been transformed into a woman whose courage had helped expose organized crime and whose love story had become a symbol of democratic resistance throughout the frontier. Jackson waited at the altar wearing a perfectly tailored suit that somehow managed to preserve his rugged frontier character while acknowledging the formal nature of the occasion. His transformation had been equally dramatic. The isolated millionaire who had rescued a stranger from a blizzard had become a community leader whose ranch served as headquarters for progressive reform movements throughout Wyoming Territory. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell's wedding ceremony itself challenged traditional conventions while honoring the spiritual significance of marriage. "Dearly beloved," she began, "we gather today not merely to witness the union of Jackson and Clara, but to celebrate the triumph of love over fear, courage over intimidation, and truth over deception." The vows that Jackson and Clara exchanged had been written by them personally, reflecting their shared commitment to principles that extended far beyond personal happiness. Jackson pledged not only to love and honor Clara, but to support her professional aspirations and to work alongside her in building a society where women could achieve their full potential. Clara promised not only to cherish Jackson, but to help him use his wealth and influence to create opportunities for others rather than merely accumulating personal advantages. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and the Progressive Christian Alliance," Dr. Elizabeth declared, "I pronounce you husband and wife, partners in love and allies in the cause of justice." The reception that followed was held on the grounds of the Double Diamond Ranch, which had been transformed into a community gathering space that welcomed people of all backgrounds and social positions. Marcus Ironcloud provided traditional Lakota blessings for the marriage, his presence symbolizing the cultural bridge building that had become characteristic of the new Wyoming Territory. During the celebration, Jackson and Clara were approached by a delegation that included some of the most influential figures in American politics and journalism. Senator Patricia Williams of Colorado, the first woman elected to the United States Senate, had traveled to Cedar Falls specifically to meet the couple whose story had inspired legislation protecting rural communities from corporate intimidation. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell Senator Williams said. "Your courage in standing up to organized crime has had implications far beyond your personal situation." The Rural Community Protection Act that recently passed Congress was directly inspired by the evidence uncovered during the investigation that began with your love story. Clara felt amazement at the scope of change that had resulted from their simple refusal to be intimidated. "Senator Williams, we never imagined that our personal situation would have such far-reaching consequences." "That's often how real social change occurs," the senator replied. "Ordinary people make extraordinary choices, and those choices ripple outward to transform entire societies. Your decision to fight for your right to love each other freely has helped establish legal protections for communities throughout the American West." The conversation was joined by James Richardson, a journalist from the New York Tribune who had been covering the social transformation occurring in Wyoming Territory. "Mrs. Hartwell, your story has been featured in newspapers throughout the country. Women's rights organizations are calling you a symbol of female independence and professional achievement." Clara's cheeks reddened at the attention, but she recognized the importance of using her platform to advance causes larger than her personal happiness. "Mr. Richardson, I hope that women reading our story will understand that love and career aspirations don't have to be mutually exclusive. A woman can be a devoted wife and a skilled professional at the same time." The impact of Clara's example was already being felt throughout the territory. The nursing school that she and Dr. Elizabeth had established in Cheyenne was attracting students from across the country, drawn by the opportunity to receive medical training in an environment that encouraged women's professional development. The curriculum combined traditional medical education with training in community organizing and social reform, producing graduates who understood healthcare as both a medical and social responsibility. Jackson's own transformation had been equally significant. The Double Diamond Ranch had become a model for cooperative agricultural practices that challenged the monopolistic tendencies of large agricultural corporations. Instead of simply maximizing profits, Jackson had restructured his operations to provide fair wages for workers, sustainable environmental practices, and support for local community development. "Jackson," said William Cody, the famous frontiersman who had attended the wedding, "you've proven that success in business doesn't require exploiting workers or damaging communities. Your ranch has become a model for ethical capitalism throughout the West." The economic model that Jackson had developed was indeed revolutionary for its time. Workers at the Double Diamond received not just wages, but profit-sharing arrangements that gave them a stake in the ranch's success. Environmental conservation practices protected water resources and soil quality while maintaining productive output. Most importantly, the ranch served as a training ground for young people who wanted to learn modern agricultural techniques without abandoning their rural heritage. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus Ironcloud stood to address the assembled guests, his words carrying the wisdom of someone who had witnessed the transformation of an entire region. "Friends," he began, "6 months ago, this community was controlled by fear and deception. Today, it represents hope and truth. This transformation didn't happen because of wealthy politicians or powerful organizations. It happened because ordinary people chose courage over comfort." Marcus gestured toward Jackson and Clara, who stood together surrounded by the community that had supported them through their darkest hours. These two people fell in love during a blizzard, but their love generated warmth that melted the ice of corruption throughout Wyoming Territory. Their story proves that personal courage can create social change when it's combined with community solidarity. The speech was interrupted by the arrival of a special messenger bearing a telegram from Washington, D.C. Dr. Elizabeth read the message aloud to the assembled crowd. "President Grover Cleveland congratulates Jackson and Clara Hartwell on their marriage and commends their courage in exposing criminal conspiracy. The president invites the couple to visit the White House to discuss their experiences and recommendations for federal policy regarding rural community protection. The invitation from the President of the United States stunned even Jackson and Clara, who had grown accustomed to the attention their story had attracted, but had never imagined it would reach the highest levels of government. The telegram represented official recognition that their love story had become a matter of national significance. "We're honored by the President's invitation," Clara said, her voice carrying new confidence born of months of public speaking and community leadership. "We look forward to sharing what we've learned about the importance of protecting democratic institutions from organized crime." As evening fell and the celebration moved indoors, Jackson and Clara found themselves in quiet conversation with some of the young couples who had been inspired by their example. Throughout Wyoming Territory, marriages were taking place between people who might never have had the courage to challenge social conventions without the precedent set by the Hartwells' successful resistance to organized intimidation. "Mrs. Hartwell," said Mary Patterson, a young teacher who had recently married a railroad worker despite her family's objections to his modest social position, "your story gave us the courage to choose love over social expectations. We're building a life based on mutual respect and shared values rather than financial considerations." Similar stories were being repeated throughout the region as young people embraced marriages based on genuine affection rather than economic arrangement or social convention. The transformation in attitudes toward love and marriage was accompanied by broader changes in social relationships that reflected growing democratic values. The evening concluded with Jackson and Clara standing together on the porch that Robert Thornfield had built years earlier, looking out at a landscape that seemed transformed by more than just the changing seasons. The Wyoming Territory of 1888 bore little resemblance to the place where they had first met during that terrible blizzard. "Clara," Jackson said softly, "when I rescued you from that train station, I thought I was saving one person's life. I had no idea that we were about to change the course of history." Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder, marveling at the chain of events that had transformed a moment of personal crisis into a catalyst for social revolution. "Jackson, I think we proved that love really can conquer fear when it's combined. With courage and community support, the transformation they had witnessed extended far beyond their personal situation. Wyoming Territory had become a laboratory for progressive social policies that were being studied and emulated throughout the United States. Women's suffrage, which had been granted by territorial law, was attracting national attention as evidence that female political participation strengthened rather than weakened democratic institutions. Economic practices pioneered at the Double Diamond Ranch were being adopted by agricultural operations throughout the West, proving that cooperative methods could be more profitable than exploitative ones. The community healthcare system that Clara had helped establish was serving as a model for rural medical care that combined professional competence with community responsibility. Most significantly, the legal precedents established during the investigation of the moral reform conspiracy had been incorporated into federal law, providing protection for communities threatened by organized crime throughout the American frontier. The Rural Community Protection Act ensured that what had happened in Cedar Falls could not be repeated elsewhere without federal intervention. As they prepared to retire to their bedroom in the ranch house that had become their shared home, Jackson and Clara reflected on the legacy they were building together. Their love story had indeed made history, but more importantly, it had created a foundation for continued social progress that would benefit generations yet to come. "Tomorrow we begin the rest of our lives," Clara said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction and anticipation for the future. "Tomorrow we continue building a world where love conquers fear," Jackson replied, his words carrying the weight of commitment not just to each other, but to the principles they had fought to establish. The blizzard that had nearly claimed Clara's life had ended with sunshine and new beginnings. The criminal conspiracy that had threatened to destroy their love had been replaced by a community committed to justice and democratic values. Most importantly, two people who had found each other during the darkest of nights had created light that would shine throughout the American West for generations to come. Their love story had not just made history, it had made history better, proving that courage, truth, and genuine affection could overcome even the most powerful forces of corruption and fear. In the years that followed, as Wyoming became a state and the American frontier evolved into modern society, the names Jackson and Clara Hartwell would be remembered not just as lovers who had defied social convention, but as pioneers who had helped establish the democratic principles that would define the American West for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.